So in the amplifier, we have some cables hanging here. I've got some in the back. I've got some kind of clustered together. Let's just take a look at those as a group overall. This front one is kind of interesting. It has, the ability to be sort of wrapped over everything, which is really cool. This was really, really easy to make. I used a freehand spline. I'm just, show end results off. And again, I'm just going to turn off show enable in viewport and renderer, and that's it. That's the spline. So I made this by simply going to create shapes freehand, and I scribbled out a spline. That's all I did. I scribbled out a spline. Now, if we take a look at that spline, we can enable it in the viewport again. So we'll get back to turning that on a second. But not only, actually, I may as well show now, I can enable that and say generate mapping coordinates because it's a procedural way of generating geometry. So it is unwrapped. I turned off cap again because I don't need to see the ends and I don't want to have to bother unwrapping the ends. So that got turned off. It's off by default right now just because um, the last one I made in this file was that way. So this one's come up with the cap off, but it's off. And then I needed to do a couple of other things. So one of them I put on is one of these spline modifiers. So if we look down, we've got a bunch of different spline modifiers as well as others that don't start with spline. The spline overlap, and this one's kind of cool. You can give it a thickness and it'll figure out how to overlap itself. Now, there aren't enough vertices in this for it to really work properly. So we need to increase the amount of vertices in the freehand spline. So what we need to do then is use another modifier called normalize spline. So X and normalize spline. And what normalize spline does, I'll just show this by going to the bottom and turning off the renderable. I'll go to normalize spline and say show knots. That's the amount of knots that were created. So it doesn't have enough detail to actually sort of create a nice, fluid overlaps going on. But in here, I can say segment length and turn that down. And what it'll do is it will redraw the spline with more knots, more or less. Okay, so whatever we need. So I've got then the spline overlap modifier is now going to work better. Okay, it's going to be able to overlap much, much better on there. Okay, you can see it shows the knots. So I'm just going to go to the bottom of the stack, turn on enable, and of course I'd come up with the thickness that I need. And since I built this in real world scale, I could use a real world value to be able to get the right size. And in the normalized spline now, I can dial up and down the thickness as well as the drape property, which basically kind of controls how rigid it is. And I can just make sure it drapes over itself, with the correct thickness. It'll have, in some cases, really complex splines. You'll see some issue areas, but how good does that really need? Now, like I said, down in the freehand spline, I turned on generate mapping coordinates, which means that if I go to my materials, in this case, I'll just make a new window. And if we go in generate a physical material, I'm going to hit H to close it because I don't like seeing all that stuff. And you can apply it either dragging out and dropping on it, right click, assign material to selection, or you can have the object picked and the material picked, the shader picked, and hit A, and that's it. It's assigned. So I'm just going to take the roughness up a bit here. And I'm going to make another node, OSL, and in this case, I'm going to go to textures, and I'm going to use my weave. And so here's my weave texture again, H. Just click sort of near the right-hand side, and all of the outputs will come up, color, and that's going to go into my base color map. Then I'm going to need things like the bump map, and it's going to go into bump, and you're going to need roughness and other things to be able to get it to look right. Now, I'm going to make sure that I am in high quality, okay? And you can see that there is certainly a texture on there, okay? It's been applied to it. I'm going to move that up a little bit so we can see it because it was buried down into my ground plane. The size of it is going to get controlled by either the scale value, but it's going to scale it in X, U, and V at the same time. I need to be able to do that differently. So I'm going to scroll on down, UV coordinates. I want to get UV transform, just H to close that up, and I'm going to plug it into the UV slot. And then I'm going to go ahead and just crank up the tiling along the U-axis, and you can see now I'm starting to get the perfect solution here as far as that goes. In the weave, I can change any and all of these settings. I'll let you figure out what they do. Okay, so I'm not going to bother trying to tell you what all those do. The easiest way to find out is just do it for yourself. So depending on the length of the spline is the amount that I'm going to have to tile the U to get it to start looking correct. Okay, and as well as the amount of tiles around it. Okay, right now it tiles once, maybe I want to do two, but you've got to do whole numbers around it or else it won't fit back together again properly on the other side. But now we've got something that's started to look braided. Braided cables are usually on an angle, and we could rotate that 90 degrees. Probably, or sorry, not 90 degrees, 45 degrees. The problem is it's just not going to look right because we're scaling it along one axis, and it's not really going to look quite right. So here's something else you can do, which is really cool if you wanted to do this. We could just go and tile this twice, let's say. And we can take this procedural solution now if we wanted. We could right click on it and we could say render map and render out 512 by 512 map. Let's say it wouldn't have to be large, it's going to be pretty small, and I'm going to hit render, and there's the map. And we could then go ahead, because this tiles, because it's 2 by 2 or 1 by 1 you could do. I could then apply this on an angle and try stretching it along. It may not work, but I could use this in Photoshop, or I could take it over to Substance. But there's really that's the start of it. So I don't need to create this. So there's other ways of dealing with this. We'll get deeper into that at another time. But there's a quick overview. Essentially, what we've got is a spline that's already unwrapped here. So if we look at the other splines, they're much the same. I'm just going to go and turn my uh, enable and render on here. If we look at the ones in the back, same thing. This is literally just a spline. That's all it is with, enable and render, generate mapping coordinates. Same in this one. Okay, it's just a line. I'm not going to collapse it. There's absolutely no reason to ever collapse it down to an editable poly. If I had to export it over to some other application, generally it'll do that collapse for me. Maybe in some cases I may have to. These ones are kind of cool. These are little twisted up ones. Let me just go down to the bottom of the stack and, I will turn off show end result again. Okay, so it's off. And so it is one tube. And if we hit F4 and take a look at the wireframe, you can see it's just a cylinder. Okay, it's just a cylinder there with a bunch of segments in it. Actually, the height doesn't even matter. It's totally irrelevant, the height. You'll see why in a sec. It's got a ray modifier on it to give me two of them. What's really cool is I could say, well, hey, instead of grid, let's do radial, and let's do three. Often wires have three, and let's not spread them apart so far. So I've literally just changed it up into a little 3-wire cluster now instead of a 2-wire cluster. And then I stuck a twist modifier on top of the stack, and I purposely made sure that the center of the twist, 2 on the keyboard, sub-object center, which is 2 on the keyboard, wasn't spot on. I just kind of knocked it off. So it just kind of didn't come up absolutely perfectly twisted. It's just kind of kicked off on a bit of an angle there. It kind of makes it look more used or whatever. A little bit of noise on it, and stuck some noise on it, so it broke it up. And again, in this case, again, X and Y, just to sort of make it a little more wiggly. And then up here, I have a path. So this is just a spline. Okay. It's just a line going from end to end. And on this object, I used a path deform and deformed it along that path. It's all 100% procedural. Once again, the really cool part about this is that it's completely editable very, very easily to be able to edit and change what's going on. Now, because cylinders are procedural, I turned on, you guessed it, generate mapping coordinates. You got to ask yourself, what color are little wires? They tend to be just solid colors and really nothing else on them. Did I even really need to unwrap it at all? Okay, something to consider. Okay, so I've got a 3-wire cluster, a little 2-wire cluster going on. I've got my patch chords, these are referred to as in the guitar world, okay, or the music world and whatnot. It's a patch chord. And there you go. Those are done, modeled and created in seconds.